I pray that you're saying yes to Him today.
Amen.
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 Trading those shame and all the disappointments in life in on the joy of Jesus Christ. And you know what? He had joy in His heart, first of all, for you, because He died for you and He died to save you and bring you into His fellowship. Pray that that's what you're being thankful for these Thanksgiving days. We're going to continue this morning in Hebrews 3. We've been in Hebrews and we found out a lot of interesting things here this morning. The superiority of Christ above everything. We've seen all through this so far. We're going to continue to see that Jesus is superior to anything that we have. As we just saw here, people have sorrows, people have problems. Jesus is the one that has already conquered all of that. And He is supreme all of that. But what did it say? We have to trade it in. Trade it in for Him. We're going to see this morning that it's all about fixing our eyes on Jesus, keeping our eyes on Him, and then we won't drift away like we read back in chapter 2. So if you have it there in front of you, if you don't have a Bible with you, share with someone next to you. There should be one under the seats in front of you. We're going to begin in Hebrews 3, verse 1. Therefore, holy brothers who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, the apostle and high priest whom we confess. He was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in all God's house. Jesus has been found worthy of greater honor than Moses, just as the builder of a house has greater honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything. Moses was faithful as a servant in all God's house, testifying to what would be said in the future. But Christ is faithful as the Son of God, God's house. And we are His house if we hold on to our courage and the hope of which we boast. Oh, Lord, what we read here today, your word, Lord, spoken, your word written to us. Lord, I pray today that as we read your word, as we hear it, as we meditate on it, oh, Lord, I just pray that you would open our hearts and our minds through your word. And Lord, may we grow in it, grow in you, grow closer to you. In your precious name we ask and pray, amen. This is one of those passages that I'm afraid most people read Hebrews, and they get this one, they say, okay, all the stuff about Moses, yeah. So they just kind of move right on. Remember we said we started this in chapter 1, or the very introduction to Hebrews. I said, keep your Old Testament handy, right? Because we're going to be referring back to the Old Testament a lot. The reason we do that is because Jesus, being God, part of the Trinity, was there when it was written. He already knows all of it. So that whole Old Testament was really about our salvation plan. And it was pointing us all the way to Jesus, all the way through. That's hard to see sometimes, and especially when we talk about this guy Moses. I know you've all seen the movie. We'll talk about that in a minute. But of course Jesus is supreme to Moses. That's what this is saying. Why do we need to hear all that again? That's a little bit strange if you're not familiar with Jewish history and God pointing us to salvation on every page, I believe. I believe you'll see Jesus pointed to on every page. But the Jews looked at Moses. They didn't have Jesus yet. He's still to come, right? So all they had to see was Moses, and Moses was their superhero. He was the one who had shown them everything about the law. He'd given them the law. We'll talk about that. He'd given them everything, and he was the one that led them out of the promised land. I was thinking a while ago, we were talking about communion. The communion was started when they were taken out of slavery to the Egyptians, weren't they? At the first Passover. So here they were. They actually took a cute little baby lamb, into their house. I don't know if you ever had sheep. We have. Ours is giving birth to sheep, and they're the cutest little things. And you really fall in love with them because they follow you. They follow their shepherd. They follow you everywhere, and they're just so wonderful, so cute. So they did. They took their best unblemished lamb, the one that was pure, into their house, and they kept it for a day, and then they killed it. Because the lifeblood of that lamb was to be spread on their doorposts so that they wouldn't die. The firstborn wouldn't die there, and they could escape death. Wow, how symbolic is that? Are we remembering that when we take our communion? The Jews knew that. They do that. They practice that. They also practice all the laws that are read, at least all the laws that Moses gave them on a regular basis. And Moses was their superhero. He was all that the Jewish religion was really based on and founded on. And it was Moses who was, through God's power, had led them out of slavery, through the desert, and into the promised land. Moses was their guy, their superhero, you know. Cecil B. DeMille had been back there, he would have made a movie a long time ago, wouldn't he? He was the greatest hero in the history of the Jews. We have to understand who Moses was to the Jews to understand Hebrews 3. That's why we're going to spend a little time on it here this morning. You need to know exactly what it meant to them, and also what he meant, what he was telling for the future to us about who Jesus would be. That's who they, or who, in this case, who Jesus was. Now look, I know a lot of you have seen the movie, but Hollywood will never make a movie that can compete with the reality of who Moses was and what he did to the Jews. You know, here, Moses wasn't created in Hollywood. I know it's going to be a disappointment to some people. And he was created by God for God's purposes. He wasn't cast by a Beverly Hills casting agency. You know, I'm sorry, you know, that's a big, it breaks a lot of people's hearts always. He was chosen, he was cast by God for his epic performance for God. Moses was born into a human home in bondage. Not much of a way to start a movie, is it? He was under an edict that he should be killed. So his mother sneaks him out and floats him out on the reeds, and what happens? The Pharaoh who had issued this edict, his daughter, thank you. I had to get all that, thank you. Help me. His daughter finds him in the reeds and takes him in and raises him in the home, and he becomes a prince of Egypt, one of their very best. And it was a miracle of God that got him out of that, wasn't it? It was a miracle of God that sent him out into the desert. Anybody here been out in the desert? Yeah, every hand ought to be raised. We have, haven't we? It was God that sent him there. It was God that brought him back out of the desert. It was God that brought him and made all these plagues, all this suffering for Egypt. So the people of the world could see God's power through Moses. God's power was in every one of those plagues. You know, there were 10 plagues, right? If you go back and it's trivia. Next time you play trivia on TV, every one of those plagues, well, every one of them matched one of their 10 major gods. So it was God saying, you got your gods? I am the only God. He was showing them everything, all the way through, all of those plagues. You know what? That was a display of God's power. That was a movie never before seen coming to you in life. 3D in reality. I wrote this, and I'll turn to blood. And then I got to thinking about that. This is off script. When Jesus came, he turned the water into wine. You know, here's God doing all these things. Everything about nature, God's in control of it. It was Moses who was the deliverer. You get that? That's key. Moses was the deliverer of the Jews, who they thought was their deliverer. And his delivery radiated all through his life. Everything that he did. Remember he went up on the mountain? And he came down and he gave all those things and all that Shekinah glory. That wasn't because he had a really bald head. It was because he had all this, the glory of God. He'd been face to face with God. We'll come back in a minute. He was also Israel's deliverer, but also their greatest prophet. He connected indirectly. But all the rest of the prophets that we find in the Bible connected indirectly with God somehow or another. You know, he used all kinds of methods. But Moses was the only one we know of that directed all of his communications. It says here face to face, but in a way that's face to face with God. The only one. All the rest of them are indirect. Remember, and here's the thing, you want proof of that? Miriam and Aaron, remember when they messed up? they kind of defiled. Here's what happened. God said, this is in Numbers 12, he's talking to Miriam and Aaron, and he said, you guys are really messed up here. Why do you doubt my prophet who I talk to face to face? Here's what he says. When a prophet of the Lord is among you, I reveal myself to him in visions. I speak to him in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. And when Moses dealt with God, it was directly, as if face to face. Remember when he received the Ten Commandments and he came down off the mountain and he's glowing and he was asked to cover his face so that nobody had to put up with it. They couldn't even look at him. And he'd just been with God. No man had been that close to God, I think, since Adam. The only one that had ever dealt with him face to face. Here's another thing Moses was to these Jewish people. He was their lawgiver. They didn't have a Congress. I'm kind of grateful for that. Jews consider the law as the greatest thing in the world. That's how they live by. That's how the rest of the world should live by. That's what God brought them into the world to go out and tell everybody. Here are God's rules. Here's God, and how you get to see him is through by minding him, by obeying him. So Moses brought the Ten Commandments. He brought all the Levitical laws. He brought all the sacrificial rites and everything, and developed them actually. All the liturgy, and he also built the tabernacle, a place where they worship, where God was to dwell. I mean, Moses did all that. Everything in the Jewish religion remembers Moses' name because he's stamped all over everything that they do. All their history and everything that they do to live out God's laws. And so God empowered Moses as a deliverer, as a prophet, and now as a lawgiver. God's power through Moses. Pretty powerful guy, wouldn't you say? And here's another thing. You're going to love this one. I know some of you are. He was the greatest historian in the history of the Jewish nation. He wrote all the books of history, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, which includes the law and all of its history. Genesis through Deuteronomy. And here's the thing, and this is the part that just blows me away. God did all of that in his life. He's superior to any human being the Jews had ever known that had lived. But listen to this. He was humble. Numbers 12 says, now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. All of that, and yet he's still humble. I read one guy said, well, at least he didn't let it go to his head. That's because his head was sized by God. It'll always be the same under God. Moses was chosen by God, the deliverer of God's people, a prophet who communicated directly with God. He was God's first and most important lawgiver. He was their chief historian and writer, since he wrote the law and all the history, the Pentateuch. And in all of that, he was humble. The most humble man that had ever lived. Wow. That's a pretty powerful guy. I'd kind of want him to be my leader too, wouldn't you? Now let's go back to Hebrews 3:1. Moses was the apostle and the high priest of the Old Testament. Now, everybody, we talked about this, I think maybe in Sunday school, but apostle, you know what apostle means? It means that's the one who is sent. It is sent out. Moses is the one who was sent. The high priest was the intercessor between them and God. Moses was that too, right? And so God appointed his representative, Moses, as the high priest. He was the appointed high priest. Now, it's true. I know somebody's going to get me for this, so let me just go back and fix this. Aaron was appointed the high priest, right? So we know he was the high priest. But it was Moses and not Aaron that did all the liturgical practices. He was the one that set up all the tabernacle ceremonies, and he appointed Aaron for God as to be the intercessor, the one in the temple or in the tabernacle. But Moses was still the intercessor between God and his people. My favorite story of that, that example. Remember when they were fighting the Amalekites? Remember that story? Here come the Amalekites, and Moses goes up on a hill, because that's a strategic advantage in battle. He goes up on a hill to look down to it, see how it's going. But the deal was, as long as Moses could hold up the rod, the staff that God had given him, they would win. Well, this came at the end of the desert trek, so Moses was probably somewhere around 110, 120, getting on up there. And it's harder to hold up things now than when he was earlier, right? So he's holding up his staff, and here come the Amalekites. Holds up his staff, and they're winning. The Jews are winning. But then he gets tired, and then they start losing. So they get him a rock, and he sits down on the rock so he can hold up his staff. And then Aaron and Hur take his hands and hold him up so they can do. So Moses is still the intercessor between God. You get that? Between God and mankind, and Aaron's just his assistant. He's the one that's there to help him out. So Moses really is the intercessor. I love it. By the way, the Amalekites did lose. I don't know if they've made a movie of that one yet, but good battle. And Moses did keep the staff up there long enough. Later, in another time when you really see that Moses is still the main priest or the intercessor. Remember the golden calf celebration? And the party giver was Aaron. And Aaron was the one who got in trouble because he'd thrown this party without God, went back to other. And it was Moses who interceded and saved him. So Moses really is the intercessor. He is the ultimate high priest. That's the point of this whole thing. We call him the apostle and the high priest. And he performed all the functions in the temple too. But Moses functioned as the greatest apostle and priest of his people. And for this, he was also honored. Exodus 33:8 says, "And whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people rose and stood at the entrances to their tents, watching Moses until he entered the tent." So he had his own fan club, right? And I think it's interesting that, and they did, all of them were. He was a man to be honored because God had worked so powerfully through him for his people. I read where some theologians believe that, when Moses died, God buried him out in the desert. Nobody could find his body. I think that they did that because the fan club might have dug him up and worshipped his bones. There's some theologians that believe that. That's why God hit him. Anyway, whatever that's worth. The book of Deuteronomy closes with Moses' epitaph, and here's what it says. "Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those miraculous signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all of his officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of Israel." To all Jews then and even now, Moses was just the greatest there ever was, the greatest there ever could be. One earlier tradition in some of the early Jewish history says that Moses was superior to the angels. He was the best any man could have ever been. So if we understand that, now we can see why the Jews held him, we get a glimpse of it, or why the Jews held Moses in such high esteem. The greatest man that ever lived. And now we can begin to understand why in Hebrews 3 that the writer thinks it important to establish the superiority of Christ over Moses. Here's why. First thing we saw back in chapter 2. If we don't hold Jesus where he should be, in our thoughts and in our eyes and all that we are, we're going to drift away. We talked about that just a little bit in Sunday school this morning, didn't we? If we don't keep our eyes fixed on Jesus in all that we do, we get taken in by all the noise and everything going on around us, don't we? So here's what the writer says. And this is a command. In verse 1, it says, "Therefore, holy brothers who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, the apostle and high priest whom we confess." There's a difference. Jesus is really our apostle, the one sent from God, and our high priest, right? This command, this is a command. It's not a drill sergeant command, so you don't have to get down on the floor and give me 50. It's a friendly calling to a unity and experience in following Jesus Christ. It's a calling to their brotherhood and to their holiness in their brotherhood and their mutual sharing. That's his call to us. To follow, fix our eyes on Jesus, and all of us to do it in unity and sharing him with one another. This is a command, but it's clear and it's specific, isn't it? And it says to focus on Jesus Christ, who is the one God sent to us. He is God's sent man, the apostle to you and me. And he's also our high priest. Even now, he sits at the right hand of God, interceding for us, all who have come to him and received him. You know, Hebrews is the only book of the Bible where Jesus is called apostle. He's an apostle once and a priest, I think, 12 times. But using those two words together here are very important, terribly important. Underline that in your Bible if you're an underliner. Over 10 times in John's writings, Jesus tells us that he was sent by the Father into our world. He's definitely an apostle, the sent one, isn't he? Jesus is the first apostle. He's the only apostle, really. He's the head of all apostles. And his apostleship is prior to the apostleships, even in the New Testament. He's the only one that I could say that he was sent on a mission impossible. And he's the only one that could have made it mission accomplished. There's another movie, isn't it? Well, we got a lot of movie references here this morning. And of course, Jesus is also the high priest, the ultimate high priest. He was perfectly human and he was perfectly divine. So who better than to be between man and God than someone who's been both? We couldn't have a better high priest, could we?